I just asked is whether there is possibility to speak out on the concept of environmental autonomy as well. And then I decided to start a research on the concept. And then I'm here right now working on this issue. But as I said, with your feedbacks and comments, I think it will be better for me to improve the research itself. This is my outline, as you see, why I started the research, the first one, and then research questions, main ones, and the sub-questions of the research. And I will touch on the autonomy under international law a little bit, but not very detailed way, because all 2 days, actually, we talked about it. Jacob also touched on the philosophic way of understanding the non-territorial autonomy. So I will just touch on or just show the importance from the perspective of international law, but I will not go in details. And then I will focus on the territorial autonomy and then non-territorial autonomy and the linkage between the minority rights, human rights, and the state types, so international law as well. And I will give the examples from New Zealand, Bolivia, and Sweden, but these are just examples. I would like to underline it, because you know that from the academic way, when you say that these are the cases, there should be some criteria to use the countries or the regions to make a comparative contrast analysis. So these are the examples, not the case studies. I will just show some ways of their giving some rights to the indigenous peoples. First of all, this concept, environmental autonomy concept, focusing on the legal perspective in the literature, none. So there is no that kind of perspective. There is just, I found just one thesis, a master thesis, which is touching somehow to the environmental autonomy. And there is also some interchangeable usage of the autonomy, indigenous autonomy, environmental autonomy. It can change, so there is a linkage in between indigenous peoples and the environmental autonomy in this research as well, because we cannot talk about the environmental autonomy somehow touching on the rights of the indigenous peoples right now in the literature. And to make an analysis on the environmental autonomy, I have to somehow also see the inadequacy of the current legal system, because the current legal system, current international law, does not help us to create this kind of concept, actually. Its current concept is not enough to talk about that kind of concept. To include the environmentalist perspective and the collectivity-based, as you said, Jacob, group-based human rights approach is also necessary to talk about the environmental autonomy in the literature as well. So in this research, I am planning to go on with this environmental autonomy issue in my research field, but in this research, I am planning to, as the title, as you understand from the title, emerging concept. So I'm trying to explain what kind of elements it can consist under international law, what can be the legal basis for that kind of concept, again, under international law. So this is an emerging concept, as I said, so don't wait to see at the end of the research a definition, a legal definition for the concept itself, because it's not easy to just with one research to lead to a concept that can be accepted under international law. These are the research questions. The first one, the main one, is it possible to have a concept of environmental autonomy under international environmental law? And to answer these questions, I have 4 other questions as well. The second one, the concept of autonomy, and so non-territorial and territorial autonomy, but in the paper as well. I'm not going in details to this concept. I'm just trying to show the linkage between the indigenous rights and the environmental autonomy. And so regarding the territorial autonomy, I have to somehow discuss the state types, self-determination, succession, continuity, Ouphouet-Potitésis principle, etc., etc. These kind of legal issues. And then environmental autonomy, if we will deal it under international law, how we can deal with it? This is the other question, and the relation between the indigenous people's rights. And in a nutshell, when you look at the concept of autonomy, we see on the one hand territorial autonomy, on the other hand non-territorial autonomy. As you already experts working on these issues, you know that territorial autonomy is somehow related to the territory itself. From the nature, from the concept itself, we can understand it very well. So it is, when we look from the international law perspective, it's very, very related to the state types, what kind of state types, federalism, regionalism, and so self-determination, continuity, as I said. But when we look to the interdependency, multiplicity, and the complex administrative legal entities, then we have to refer to the non-territorial autonomy, because territorial autonomy is not an adequate concept which can answer to these questions or which can provide these facilities for that kind of concept. And non-territorial autonomy, actually in general, there are two principles, but we already discussed in these sessions about non-territorial autonomy so much as well, functionality and personality principle. And from the personality principle, there should be an agent of self-rule, and this is a legal entity. And the functionality principle, there should be a network of institutions. And when we look to non-territorial autonomy specifically, we see that I have referred to some very important scholars when I am giving the elements of the non-territorial autonomy. It is also related to state types or ideology, I can say, consociationalism. So consociationalism or consociational arrangements is very important for the non-territorial autonomy. But the thing is here, as you know, they are seen generally opposite to the logic of autonomy. So when we look to the consociational arrangements, they are logically opposite to the autonomy concept itself. But still, when we look to the non-territorial autonomy, we have, or consociational arrangements, we have to refer to each of them, or we have to link to them when we are referring to them in the literature under international law. So autonomy under international law, after making an analysis on this concept, I'm not going into details, but we have under the territorial autonomy state types and what kind of states these are. Federal states, regional states, already they are controversial, as I see from your presentations as well. Some can define itself as a regional state, the other can federal state, blah, blah, blah. And self-determination, so self-determination, succession, all these concepts of international law actually related to territorial autonomy concept. And what we have under the non-territorial autonomy, because I can use for my research non-territorial autonomy concept, not territorial autonomy, we have minority rights, we have indigenous rights, and we have consociational arrangements here. And so, from the international law perspective, minority rights, when we examine the minority rights, there is a huge number of treaties, which is somehow referring to the minority rights. But the thing is, there is no international treaty which is widely accepted by most of the countries, most of the states. So when we look at the current existing treaties referring to the minority rights, actually, again, there is another problem. They have no legal force. So they are not binding. But we have a very important international legal document. It is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And this document is very important. Still, it's a non-legally binding resolution. But it makes a direct reference to the right of self-determination, the right to autonomy and self-government. So it is very valuable for speaking out the environmental autonomy concept and also indigenous rights. And here, environmental autonomy and that environmentalist collectivity-based perspective, it also requires to be further examined or further research as well. What I mean with environmentalist perspective, what I mean collectivity-based perspective for the human rights as well. So why we go on to this direction? There are some preparatory reasons to go on for environmental autonomy or indigenous autonomy. First of all, the vulnerability of the indigenous people, their way of the life, they are bound to the nature and they are bound to the natural life, and extractivist industries in the current time actually, because these mining or deforestation activities of the states can really damage to their natural life or their nature as well. So we have, as I said, United Nations declarations on the indigenous people's rights on the one hand is very important, but we have another document, international legal document, which is also referring to this autonomy issue and indigenous rights as well. It is the International Labour Organization Convention on, again, indigenous and tribal peoples. So as you see at the end, we have two documents that we can refer under international law, and two of them are somehow related to indigenous people's rights. And needs to be further discussed. What I said in the beginning of my presentation, an emerging new concept. So under international law, to define a concept which can be accepted under international law from a legal perspective, we need some elements to discuss. And one of them is, this will be a right, environmental autonomy will be a right or not, and will be just for the indigenous peoples or local people in other countries as well. And what kind of matters it will include in itself. And it will be somehow about the territory as well, because if it is again somehow linked to the territorial autonomy as well. And for which reasons we will give that kind of autonomy to indigenous peoples or to local people in the states. And this can be protect the environment, their life, traditional life, etc., etc. Why I set these examples for the presentation, because as you see, and I see from your presentations as well, this is really changing from one perspective to the other perspective. So in New Zealand, for example, New Zealand is not among the 23 countries which ratified the ILO Convention. Two others, Bolivia and Norway, the ones that ratified the convention. But still we see that New Zealand and the Maori's life, Maori's, the indigenous people in the New Zealand, is very good example of having rights and having the, unofficially actually, the life of the environmental autonomy. And they did not ratify this convention. And for Bolivia, it's a very good example because in the constitution, there's a direct reference to the autonomy issue, etc., etc. It ratified the convention, but there are still problems regarding the extractivist industries like the Tipnis project. Perhaps you have heard about it, but there was a political instability in the country for a while, but now I think it is stable. But still, even if it's made a very good contribution to the discussion, to the debate on that subject, we see that it did not. It has still problems with the extractivist industries as well. Some people in Sweden, perhaps, I did not go in details because I don't have so much time. I can just come back to the current issues regarding the Sweden and Sami people in Sweden. There is a very current decision of the Swedish Supreme Court, and we see that in this decision, Sweden also gives direct reference to the rights of the indigenous people, their autonomy, their self-determination rights, etc., etc. It's a very recent case, so it's very important, I think. As a conclusion, what I can say that there are two documents I can refer when I am speaking about environmental autonomy. UNDRIP, one of them, ILO Convention, the other one. And what I see, they are still not sufficient to make this concept, which is debatable under the international law. So we need a different perspective. We need an ecosystem-based or environmentalist perspective, and we need a collectivity-based approach towards human rights. And why it should be related somehow to the rights of the indigenous peoples, because there is already an ongoing and developed case law, customary law, and local and national implementation, the rights of the indigenous peoples, so it can be easily adapted to the autonomy, and perhaps for the first step, indigenous peoples, but for the second people, for the local people, nomad people, perhaps in your countries, that kind of people can live as well. As a next step, what I am planning to, these are the examples, but the next step will be to study on the case studies of some Sami people, and it will be a comparative analysis between Norway, Finland, and Sweden. And it will also refer to the, as you see from the presentation, I didn't refer to the environmental impact assessment procedures of the countries. I didn't refer to the corporate social responsibility concept or human rights approach, but within these case studies, they will also include all of them as well. Thank you so much.